Good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. This is our auditorium Bible class, and so I'm glad that you took advantage of that opportunity this morning. If you're tuning in virtually, thank you for being with us in that capacity. We're going to pick up where we left off last week, but we are going to review a bit because we just started a new series of lessons last week. In fact, we started it towards the end of class as we had finished up the prior series of lessons we've been doing. And as I mentioned last time, this series of lessons was requested. I'm like that old radio station from when we were kids. I take requests. And so someone requested, could you spend some time, or actually they asked the request to be a sermon, and I said, I don't know if I can put this in a sermon. It would require that we have a little more time. So we're looking at the offerings that were offered during the Old Covenant. Now, we won't exhaust the subject. In fact, I know this probably isn't everybody's favorite subject in the Bible. I know that everybody's not running to make a series of devotionals from the book of Leviticus. In fact, oftentimes the book of Leviticus is that portion when you're reading the Bible through in a year that you kind of get bogged down in. And it has its difficulties. And it doesn't always have a lot of application to us. It certainly isn't our mandate for worship today under the new covenant. So I know that it has its difficulties. But what we're going to do over the course of the next several weeks is look at these offerings. Not to exhaust the subject, but to better understand, if you were a Jew and you came to worship, what was required of you? What did it look like? What were the particulars? And so hopefully this will be something to satisfy some of your curiosity on the subject. And if not, I don't plan it to be a long series of lessons. So we'll move on to something else, and I'll remind you, I take requests. All right. So we're going to talk about the offerings. Again, we won't exhaust the subject, and there are many to discuss. There are, as we'll discuss this morning, burnt offerings. There are grain offerings and drink offerings, and there are other various offerings that had to do with violations of the law. And we'll talk more about them. Also, there were special offerings that were made on feast days and the Day of Atonement. I'll mention this also. Someone stopped me in the foyer after our class last week when we announced what it'd be about, and they said, will you go over the feasts and explain the different feasts so we understand some of the particulars? So when I get to the offerings that surround those feast days, I'll spend a little bit of time. Well, what was the Feast of Booths, for instance? What were the requirements and what did they do? And so we'll talk about some of those as it pertains to some of the observances and specifically the details of the offerings on those special days and feast days. There were offerings, for instance, on the new moon and the Sabbath that were unique. And so we'll talk about some of those too. All right. So I do want to go over this ever so briefly. I know we went over this last week. We're not going to look up the verses, but I think it's worth mentioning that there was a time period during the days of the patriarchs before there was the law, and the law governed the offerings. Before there were those particulars and specifics, the patriarchs made offerings going back to Cain and Abel. We don't know the details of the instructions, but they were under the understanding that this was something that God desired of them. And so they made an offering. And we looked at some of those particulars, probably familiar to us. The first literal mention of a burnt offering is from Noah. When Noah, following the flood, he made an offering, a burnt offering. And we noted that each of these had reference to an altar. An altar. Now, the altars would have been makeshift in that they were made of stones or made of earth, and they would have just been a place where they could sacrifice the animal and then burn the animal. Very rudimentary. There's no detailed instructions. There's no parameters for building the altar. It doesn't have to have certain dimensions. And then we see that each of the patriarchs that we think about, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all made an altar. And what was interesting to note about Jacob was he would stay in one place, make an altar and make his offering, and then he would move to another place and he would make another altar. It was transitory. It was wherever he went, it was an altar for him to make his offerings to God. And so that's a really just simple overview that there is a precedent for making offerings going all the way back to Cain and Abel. references to burnt offerings and animal sacrifices, again going all the way back to Cain and Abel and Noah and the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then we ended here last week talking about something that's, I think, important. As we get the parameters and instructions for making the offerings, those are within the confines of a specific time frame, and it's during the days of the traveling tabernacle. Now, later we all know that we would find Solomon building the temple there in Jerusalem, and that would be where these sacrifices were made. But God gives the instructions, and we read these, and then the bell rang. In Exodus chapter 25, there are the basic instructions for building this traveling tabernacle. And now, I mentioned last week, I don't tend to go over all the details. If you want to look up, how many cubits stuff was, and how many pomegranates was on it, what color it was, and the curtains were made of what type of animal, and all that, you can read all that. That's not my intent to go over that. We would get bogged down if we're not careful. And then he describes the dimensions and particulars of an outer court. But I do want to pause here because this is important as we think about sacrifices, especially this morning as we talk about burnt offerings. The altar is described in Exodus chapter 27. Now, I don't want to just sit here and read all this to you, but I do want to encourage you to take note that there are some particulars. In Exodus chapter 27, read a couple of verses with me. Start in verse 1. Here are the instructions that Moses was given as a pattern for the people to have this traveling tabernacle, which included the outer walls and curtains and then all of the various particulars. Now, one of those particulars that I want to highlight is that they were to build and construct an altar. Look at verse 1 of Exodus 27. He says, "You shall make an altar of acacia wood," and then he gives the dimensions, 5 cubits long by 5 cubits wide. The altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. And then he goes on to describe some of the other features, to overlay it with bronze and some of the necessary articles or utensils or implements, what they were to do with the ashes, and some of those particulars. We won't go into the details. He had it on a pole, and we could take the time to mention some of the instructions for it traveling and those, but we won't. I think it is worth mentioning the dimensions, just for curiosity's sake. How big was this altar? Well, if we do, I don't know, I think we all know cubits is roughly 18 inches from the tip of your finger to your elbow, the average man. Of course, I'm not going to, make you put your tip of your fingers to your elbow and mine and then note there's a discrepancy, but roughly 18 inches, give or take. So how big was this altar? Roughly a little shy of 8 feet by 8 feet. Now, you can use your imagination what 8 feet is. It'd be me laying on the ground and then another 3.5 feet or so. and that's how big it was this way and big it was that way, and it made a square. And that's what it was. And there were some particulars that were given about having the grate for that and all the coverings and how you would do that. And man, if you really want to read, we'll mention it but won't read it. Leviticus 6 talks about some of the instructions for the burnt offering, which include the use of the utensils and what they were to do with the ashes. And you can just read about that to your heart's content with those details. And then we see that there's the construction mentioned in this pattern of the holy place that was designated for the priests to enter. And there were some particulars in there, for example, where they kept the showbread, or where they kept the lamp that was burning with a candelabra, or the various particulars that are described as that lamp that was burning. And then, of course, there's the curtain that separated the most holy place, where only the high priest would go once a year on the Day of Atonement. And we'll talk more about that and look at that when we get to that particular special event and the offering that surrounded that. Now, I don't know if you like pictures. I don't know if they help you. I don't know if you're not crazy about them. But there are countless artist renditions of these particulars as they're described, with their benefits and flaws. But these artist renditions give us kind of an idea. Now, one thing that we note about this as we read through it is that they would camp And they would put the traveling tabernacle that they erected and had all the instructions for packing down and carrying and who could do it, and we're not getting into all those particulars. But they would erect this in the center of the camp, and then they would, by tribes, they would then camp around this structure. And so you can see the walls that would have been curtained and the entrance on the lower end of this picture. And then, again, it's just a picture, and we'll look at some more in just a moment. That first place that they would stop there, you can see the smoke ascending, would be where they made the offering. And then they would have an area, a basin, where they would wash a pool of water there. And then they would go into the holiest, the priests, to do various things. Now, if we get this is less busy. This kind of gives you the idea. They were camped around it, and there were various particulars, and this kind of takes those out so we can look at the basic artist rendition here. But if you see the first structure there, that is the altar, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. Yes, ma'am.
How often were these offerings done on that altar?
Yeah, that's precisely what we're going to talk about.
Because I mean, it's a lot of I'm hearing this, and then this was cut, and the blood was. I mean, is someone cleaning this up after each?
The fire pretty much cleans it up, and then they discard the ashes. Okay. All right. So if we get this sort of less busy view, that first structure you come to is this altar. That's roughly 8 feet by 8 feet squared. And then, of course, there's some instructions for it being bronze and having the horns and the various holes that you would put the pole through to be able to move it. And then you get into that water basin. And then you get into this most holy area, or the holy and then the most holy behind the curtain. And there's where you see the candelabra, the candles on one end, the table for the showbread. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about burning incense or some of the other offerings that we'll mention later. And then we see behind this curtain the Ark of the Covenant, where the high priest would go on this one occasion on the Day of Atonement. And we'll talk about that probably in a great deal of detail a little bit later in this series. Now, this is kind of a close-up. Again, I appreciate these are artist renditions. I didn't get these out of the inspired Bible. So, we're using our imagination a bit. But it represents some of the tools and implements they would use for the instructions, not only of keeping the perpetual fire, but things like were mentioned, taking off the ashes and where to put those and the like. And this just gives you kind of an artist rendition for what it's worth. All right, any questions about that and those general, generic overview of understanding that there was a precedent for making offerings, that God then instructed Moses during the dispensation of the law to erect this traveling tabernacle, which included the altar and the other various things that we'll mention that were utilized to make these offerings. Any questions about those basics? All right, let's first talk about the burnt offering. Now, we're in Leviticus chapter 1. If you were here last week and indulged in the homework, you've read Leviticus chapter 1 and Leviticus chapter 2. We'll talk about the burnt offering this morning, and as time allows, we may get to the grain offering, but likely not. If we go to Leviticus chapter 1, here we find some of the basic instructions for burnt offerings. It was the offering of, basically livestock. Now, that's a broad term. We'll look at some of the specifics in just a moment. But look at Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock, of the herd and of the flock. Now, herd and the flock are a distinction that we'll note in just a moment. But it also included another item for those who didn't have herds and flocks, which were of monetary value. Not everybody could afford them. Okay, so drop down and note, I did want to mention ever so briefly Leviticus chapter 22. If you'll fast forward and turn over to Leviticus chapter 22 quickly, start reading in verse 19 there. Look at Leviticus chapter 22, starting in verse 19. You shall offer of your own free will a male without blemish from the cattle, from the sheep, and from the goats. And then he goes on to describe that you're not to offer anything with a defect. And that's interesting because as we study the prophet Malachi, we know that the people were guilty of violating this portion of the law, bringing in maimed, crippled, blind, and defective animals as an offering. And so we see some of these particulars regarding the offering as far as what the animal was not to be defiled, crippled, maimed, blind. Okay, so we're offering of the livestock. It's mentioned, as was mentioned there in Leviticus 22 and also here, that we're dealing with a male without blemish. Look at verse 3. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. He goes on to give some basic instructions of that, but before we get there, let's note this. It was a male without blemish. If it was of the herd, it would be a bull, if you will, a male cow or ox, but cow rather. And here we also see, if we drop down to verse 10, if the offering is of the flocks, of the sheep, and of the goats. And so he's making this distinction. It can be a male without blemish of your herd or of the flock of the sheep and goat. And these are burnt offerings, and those are some of the particulars. Now he also mentions, if we drop down to verse 14, if the burnt sacrifice of his offering to the Lord is of birds, and he shall bring, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or young pigeons. Now, we haven't gotten to this yet, but I'll mention it here. You might be familiar with this as you've studied the gospel accounts. That when Jesus was brought to be dedicated to the temple following the purification of his mother, that they brought this turtle dove. Again, pointing to their lack of financial prowess to be able to bring another offering. But it could be any of these animals based upon your status or what you had available. A male without blemish. Now, interestingly, we note in verse 4 some of the responsibilities. Look at verse 4. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it'll be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's son, shall bring the bull and sprinkle the blood all around the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And then he gives some instructions for skinning the animal. The animal was burned in its entirety, but the animal was skinned. And then there's a whole lot of details that surround the priest keeping a portion and that. Interestingly, you would bring the animal, you would place your hand on the head of the animal, and you would kill the animal. And then the animal would be given to the priest to do the particulars of administering the blood to the altar and then burning the animal in its entirety, minus it being skinned. And it was burnt by the priest. If we drop down to verse 8, look at verse 8. Then the priest, Aaron's son, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash the entrails and its legs with water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire. And then we get this phrase that is very repetitive that we'll see several times, not only as we talk about a burnt offering, but as we talk about the other offerings. It says this offering made with fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. This notion of an offering is the idea that literally it's an ascending. The idea is that the aroma or the smoke and the byproduct are raising up or ascending to God who receives it as pleasing. And we'll see that in the other offerings as well. All right, let me pause. Questions? Rod? Yeah, it's, again, there's a lot of foreshadowing to the cross. In other words, this was an offering of something innocent that was required for your, on occasion, guilt. But those are not the only occasions when an offering was made. Offerings were not made just for sin offerings or just for trespass offerings or just for guilt. And so we're going to mention that a little more next. But yes, the idea was you took some burden of responsibility to have something innocent die for your sacrifice to God. And again, foreshadowing obviously to the cross. All right, so one of the questions on the table is, under what occasion or with what frequency would you make these offerings? Now, there are a number of occasions, and this isn't any attempt to exhaust those occasions. Let's just mention a few. I think one that's important to mention is there were daily offerings. I'd like to ask you to maybe just put your finger and mark Leviticus chapter 1. We'll go back to it in just a moment. But go over with me to the book of Numbers. And look there in chapter 28. Look at Numbers chapter 28. Read with me these first handful of verses. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel and say to them, My offering, my food for my offering, made by fire as a sweet aroma to me, you shall be careful to offer to me at their appointed time." He goes on to say in verse 3, "And you shall say to them, This is the offering made by fire, which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs in their first year without blemish, day by day, as a regular burnt offering. The one lamb you shall offer in the morning, the other lamb you shall offer in the evening, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering." Now, we haven't talked about grain offering yet. The grain offerings are next, and we'll look at some of those basic things in just a moment. He goes on to say in verse 6, "It is a regular burnt offering which was ordained at Mount Sinai for a sweet aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord. And its drink offering," we haven't talked about that yet either, "shall be 1/4 a hin for each lamb. In a holy place you shall pour out the drink to the Lord as an offering. The other lamb you shall offer in the evening. As the morning grain offering and drink offerings, you shall offer it as an offering made by fire, a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord." So there were perpetual daily offerings that were done by the priests. And they would follow these basic parameters, but there are some more instructions for them in Leviticus chapter 6, including things like the type of garments they were to wear and all the various particulars as to how they were to carry out these offerings. But when we think about the offerings, we're probably most readily thinking about a regular individual who would bring an offering. These daily offerings were offered by the priests, and they were a part of what was sanctioned as their duties to make a morning and an evening sacrifice, and these are some of the particulars. Or we could read Leviticus 6 and see more of the particulars. All right. And again, I'm not exhausting the occasions where people would bring a burnt offering. I'm not exhausting them. I'm just mentioning some of the occasions. All right, go over to, for example, to Leviticus chapter 4. Look at Leviticus chapter 4. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, if the appointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish, as a sin offering. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle on the meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting." And he goes on to describe some of the particulars of what they'll do. But what's the occasion? The occasion is someone is guilty of sin. And so that is an offering for that particular offense. or violation. If you were guilty of that violation, bring the animal, put your hand on its head, kill the animal, give it to the priest, and the priest also had to make sacrifice for his own violations of the law. Something the book of Hebrews points out, that a priest had to make an offering for himself and for the people, where, of course, we know the distinction between Jesus not having to make an offering for his own. All right, so there's the daily offering. There's the individual who's guilty of a sin or a trespass who is making that offering. Again, these are what we might call obligatory, but also free will. In other words, these offerings aren't prescribed to... Okay, well, let's mention some of the other occasions, and then we'll note that there is some sense of obligation, but also a sense of voluntary. There are a couple of occasions that this idea of being defiled is mentioned, and the solution being bringing a burnt offering. One of those is in Numbers chapter 6, in the context of speaking about the vow of a Levite. Look at Numbers chapter 6. Look at Numbers chapter 6. Let's drop down to verse 8 there. Look at verse 8. Verse 9, rather, excuse me. And if anyone dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, then he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. On the 7th day he shall shave it. Then on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves, 2 young pigeons to the priest at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And the priest shall offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering to make atonement for him because he sinned regarding to a corpse. There are many occasions where someone might be defiled and then they bring a burnt offering to the Lord to appease God in that defilement so they can approach God. I'll give you another example. In Leviticus chapter 14, if you have leprosy, one of the things that was required of you is to show yourself to the priest, and once you were determined clean, then you made a burnt offering. And those particulars are mentioned in Leviticus 14. So there were a number of occasions where you might be defiled, whether you had touched a dead corpse, whether you had leprosy, then you would then make this burnt offering. You were, under the old covenant, you would make vows. And when you had completed that vow, one of the process was that you would offer a burnt offering. We see that here. We can read it ever so briefly. Then we're in verse 16. Then the priest shall bring before the Lord an offering for his sin offering, a burnt offering, and he shall offer the ram sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord with a basket of unleavened bread. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But here is the fulfillment of a vow and an offering made. But then the one that's probably most common to us, again, in the context of our understanding of Jesus, where Mary and Joseph, following her purification, brought him and made this offering. Well, it was a burnt offering. It was a burnt offering in which they would take the animal, in the instance of turtle doves or a pigeon, and they would cut it, and then they would burn it on the altar. All right, let's look at Leviticus chapter 12, because this would be more pertinent to regular old common folk daily life than maybe some of the other more less common things of touching a dead corpse or having leprosy. Look at chapter 12. Let's drop down there to verse 6. Oh, I'm in Numbers. Leviticus chapter 6. Drop down to verse 12 there. Oh, I'm in Leviticus. I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Leviticus chapter 12. Look starting in verse 6 there. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, and if you want those instructions in their detail, they're the first 5 verses of chapter 12. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from her flow of blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female. And if she does not bring a lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. if she's not able, verse 8. One is a burnt offering and the other is a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for her and she will be clean. This is part of the natural process as described of a woman having a child, which would have been a common occurrence. All right. Now, I went through that pretty quickly. I didn't exhaust the potential occasions. We just mentioned a few. All right. Let me pause. Questions? I know I went quick. Arnie.
When we look at life today and we look back in the old, we can see that how much we have been relieved from the old to the new. And how easier it is to have this relationship with God and to bring our body a living sacrifice and to do the Lord's will in a much easier way. Also, when you look into the world today, you see that there are still all different kinds of offerings. They have weekly, they have monthly in different countries. They do all these kinds of things in a very, very different way.
One of the things you mentioned it's easier. I don't know if it's easier. I just think it's different.
When I say easier, is that the law, it was too much when you do look at the numbers of law that what you had to go through with the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think it was more demanding. I think there were more reminders, I guess. You know, that's why what we do on the first day of the week when we take the Lord's Supper is of paramount significance. And so here we are celebrating a one-time sacrifice for all. We're celebrating this one sacrifice. We're declaring the benefits of His death and atoning work on the cross. And we do that each Lord's Day. But what they had were perpetual and constant reminders of their need to make sacrifice. And so it was very different. Ben, you had a comment, question, thought?
I was just going to say, the new covenant is more about the sacrifice of the heart than the old covenant was. The old covenant was the sacrifice of your actions, which you did. And Jesus contrasts that when he talks about the fact that, in the old law, if you committed adultery, that was a sin, and sin was committing adultery. But he talks about in the New Testament about the fact that it's the condition of our heart, what's going on inside of us that matters, and that's not something that was really part of the old law.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of gravitated to that term that Nardio used. It's easier. Well, I don't think it's any easier to be a living sacrifice than it was to bring some animals and kill them or to offer these things or the other. It could almost become rote, ritualistic. In fact, that was part of the indictment that God leveled against His people often. Just cross-reference Isaiah 1, for instance. But the idea was you could get so caught up in the ritual that you'd be like, well, I sinned, I got to do this. I got this, I got to do that. I got to do this, I got to do that. And so it became very ritualistic, as opposed to it was more penance than genuine repentance. It was more, I can do this, and because I did that, I'm right with God. As to oppose, there's nothing I can do. It's what God did for me in this one-time sacrifice. And thus I do have the obligation to amend my doing and to live repentantly. But the means with which I'm right with God, because all this boils down to being right with God. I mean, because you wanted to offer this sacrifice to God to appease His wrath. You wanted to make this offering to God to be right with God. If there was any sin against you and God, that you had to rectify that because it was of imminent concern, right? And so there's a sense in which they understood and appreciated that. But the offering satisfied that. Now, we don't have the same system in which we can satisfy or appease God by making this offering or that offering and know that we're okay. But the emphasis and the point is what was done for us, the offering that was made. And that's how we're right with God. And out of the way, we find Paul and the other New Testament writers pointing us to the cross as the sacrifice, as the means, as all of that being a foreshadowing to what was ultimately God's plan. Yes?
I can't remember what the name of the Catholic doctrine is off the top of my head, but I call it like the pre-created sin plan. That's how they built a lot of the cathedrals. If you plan to sin on and do this thing, just go ahead and pay us now, and go ahead and do your thing.
Sure.
And then it's already forgiven. And I forget what it's called, but it's it can't use the same system to a degree of penance for sin, but it's premeditated.
Sure. You're describing paying for indulgences, a practice of the Catholic Church for some time. And the notion was that you could even pay a certain price for particular sins to engage in them if you donated so much. And I don't think that it's an equal comparison, but there is some comparison to this notion of if I'm guilty, I can do this and appease God. Well, if I'm guilty today, what can I do to appease God? Repent, yeah, I mean, obviously we repent of our sins, but what offering, what sacrifice? It's the cross. Now, we have to walk in the light to continually have fellowship with the blood. I appreciate that. But the point is, there's nothing we can do to appease God's wrath towards sin. That's what Jesus did. Romans 5 and verse 9. And that's why we're so thankful for Jesus. I'm sorry. Sarah was next.
Okay, so if I'm someone living back then and I sin, which is daily, whether it's intentional, unintentional, by mistake, I knew it, I didn't know it, whoopsie daisy, I didn't do something I was supposed to do. Do I have to kill an animal twice a day?
No, the priest did that for the people. And so there was a daily offering that was made. But there were also other violations that when people were guilty of them, they brought the animal.
But how often would I have to bring an animal? If it's when someone sins, how often do I have to come with my goat
Yeah.
and slit its neck? And what happens when you kill all your goats?
Well, there is no parameters for each particular violation if it demanded that you brought literally an animal sacrifice.
So it's kind of voluntary.
It was voluntary that you bring the offering. Now, there were portions that were not voluntary. But for these sin offerings, there is some parameter of voluntary to bring. Now, again, it could be imposed by the law and the people of the camp. But there were violations that would have been appeased by those daily offerings. Think about it just practically speaking. Just practically, just commonsensically. 8 feet by 8 feet. One of the things it said of the offering is it has to be burnt all night long. Y'all with me? How much room is on an 8 by 8 foot altar? How many people were there? We have the book of Numbers. Let's just do a round, rough figure. About 600,000, give or take. At any given time, it fluctuates. A few 100,000 people. I mean, was any and every person guilty of any and every violation bringing a burnt offering every time they did anything that violated the law? Well, no, it wouldn't be logical. And that's this notion here. You'd run out of sheep, wouldn't you? I mean, who has that many? But the idea was that the daily offerings satisfied those necessities. But there were occasions in which people, for individual or particular violations, brought those. And
So is it if someone was just convicted to the point they felt like they needed to do that in addition to what the priest had done to them? Was that the determining factor?
yes, it was free will, and they were not obligated for any and every violation to do things above and beyond the daily offerings that were made. But we'll get into it. There were feast days that they did have requirements to make certain offerings on those feast days. I think Tim was next. Okay. Nardia?
With the question of just now, is when we look back to our previous study that we have when Jesus asked Peter, how much shall we forgive? Is 7 times 7 or what? So we can consider the
Sure, and plus, okay, let's think a little later. Let's fast forward. Let's fast forward beyond the traveling tabernacle to the temple. Okay, the temple was where? Everybody knows, right? Jerusalem. Okay, as the time went on, did everybody live right there in Jerusalem? Okay, were there people that were several days removed traveling? Well, would they, every time they got guilty of sin, would they hop an airplane and go over there and make an offering and ride it back? Well, no. I mean, there were times that they came, and the daily offering that was made in the morning and the evening would satisfy most of those things. Now, they were prescribed and required to come on 3 particular feast days, and they did have to bring an offering. And there were also, sin offerings that they could make, but it wasn't practical that every violation of the law warranted a burnt offering. And then we'll also note the grain offering is also subject to what? The harvest. It's subject to the harvest in part. And so we'll talk about that too. All right, that's been our second bell. We'll pick up talking, the Lord willing, next week about the grain offering. So if you haven't read Leviticus 2, there's your homework. All right, appreciate your attention.